All right, welcome to St. Thomas Episcopal Church, to our study on the 7 deadly sins and the 7 classical and Christian virtues. We've already prayed. We're technologically goofballs here, and we've already taken care of the prayer for this evening, so we're just going to jump right into the 7 deadly sins portion of our study. Now we're going to start tonight with a bit of an introduction. Lent is coming up just as you know, in a couple of weeks. It's a wonderful time for us to rethink what our beliefs are, where we fall short of matching our actions to our beliefs. Time for us to reflect on all of our personal behaviors and that type of thing, and to recommit to those things that matter. So this particular study is going to connect in with those sorts of Lenten notions, and the hope is that by the time we get to the end of this, we're going to understand ourselves a little bit better. The hope is that you will not take the information that you obtain so that you can do a better job of pointing fingers at other people and the sins that you see them commit. The point is not to point fingers. The point is to be able to grasp who you are so you can engage in a deeper act of self-examination moving forward and do the kind of penitential work that you need to.
And what Bible study stays a Bible study, right?
I'm not going to be asking any of you any questions about what you do, but I can also tell you on the front end that if you choose not to come on a particular week, you will probably wonder why you chose not to come on that particular week. When we go to the doctor, we hope that one of the things they will absolutely be able to do is diagnose our illness. But in diagnosing what we think is an illness that needs to be treated, we're hoping they put a name on it. Because once they put a name on it, then we feel like we have a little bit of power over it. And once we've got that name, we can really begin to address it. And so one of the things that James and I are going to hope to do over these next several weeks is put names on particular habits, actions that we engage in so that we can recognize them more readily in ourselves. And that goes then for the virtue side of it too, so that we're understanding things about character that once upon a time, when character formation mattered more to people than it does for the most part today, we had those insights into that. But for the most part, we just don't anymore. So this is hopefully an attempt to help deal with that problem that we have about ourselves. I'm going to deal with the sins. James is going to deal with the antidotes. And I've told you can't take notes, but you really can take notes on the sin part too, since it's about self-examination. All right. So, can you find the list of deadly sins anywhere in the Bible? The answer is no. What you can find, whether you're looking in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, are lists of various sins. Short lists, long lists, they're all over in the Old Testament, for instance. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 6, you'll see this list. I'm not going to leave it up there long enough for you to really read it, but it's Proverbs chapter 6. New Testament, same way. There's a list in Galatians 5. There's another list in Colossians 3. There's yet another list in Romans chapter 1. You can come across lists of sins throughout Scripture, but not a list of so-called deadly sins. To be able to get a list of deadly sins, you're going to have to wait until monasticism begins to arise within the early church. So 300-ish, 350 or so, once the Eremitic monks are coming into their propriety there in the desert, that's when you begin to see the list of deadly sins. And so we're going to start with Evagrius. I'm not going to do much more other than just mention tonight. We've cut almost everything out of this introductory part, most basic sections we can. Evagrius is an Eremitic monk. He's not a Cenobitic monk. Eremitic means he's a hermit. He lives off by himself. If he was Cenobitic, he would live in a community of monks. That comes a little bit later. He's Eremitic. He actually was born and raised in Turkey, not in southern Turkey on the Syrian border where the earthquakes have hit. He lived on the northern portion, what was known as Bithynia, next to the Black Sea. Grew up in an urban cosmopolitan area, but when he became a Christian and became a monk, he moved from there into the desert. And you want to immediately probably say, well, shoot, if I lived in the desert, I wouldn't have to deal with temptation either. But you got it exactly backwards. He and all of these other Eremitic monks, they left the urban cosmopolitan areas and went to the desert, not to get away from temptation, but to take it on. They took the battle directly to the places that they thought you would have the most trouble dealing with temptation and the demonic. At the risk of being stupid, I would say these are Rambo monks. They take the battle to the devil out there in the wilderness. Because think about it. Whether you ever engage in acts of lust, you can fantasize all kinds of things up in this noggin. The same with anger, or envy, or issues of vainglory and pride. You've still got this to deal with, and that's all you've got to deal with out in the wilderness. So they went to the wilderness, so they had no choice but to deal with the temptations that ultimately Evagrius is going to be the first to say there really are 8 of them, he said. It's ultimately going to be pared down to 7, but he says there are 8 of them. And he called them schemata or logismoi, spoke Greek. We translate that into English. Probably the best translation is suggestions. These are suggestions about the deadly sins. What a wonderful, perfect term. Aren't sins suggestive? Or thoughts about sin suggestive? Well, these are suggestions that he's going to put forth. He has a disciple, John of Cassian, a little bit younger than him. What Evagrius puts in 2 or 3 sentences as a suggestion, John of Cassian will write entire books about it. So he has an entire book about pride, an entire book about envy that you can look at in the what are known as the Institutes. If that's too much for you, well, he condenses it and puts it all into one chapter of another book called Conferences. Jump forward another 150 years, one of the great monks of the early medieval period, Gregory the Great, he makes the transition from seeing the deadly sins as something primarily mental that we deal with to being actual physical acts in which we engage. Now, it's not that people finally figured out they could act on what they thought, but he begins to make that transition because he's in Rome itself, and so he's dealing with things that you didn't have to deal with out in the wilderness desert areas. We jump ahead from Gregory the Great. Dante, if you've ever read Dante's Divine Comedy, the 3 parts of it, hell, purgatory, and paradise. If you're reading through the hell part in the early sections of the Inferno, he has different portions of hell in which the various people who've committed deadly sins get stuck. And if that's a little too much for you, well, in purgatory, as you're making your way up Mount Purgatory, those who actually repented of their sins, their deadly sins, but didn't completely repent and still need prayers for, he deals with the deadly sins again in the purgatory section of the Divine Comedy, but they at least have the opportunity to get out ultimately of purgatory if enough people pray for them. Or if most of you probably have not had Divine Comedy, but maybe most of you will remember Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from high school English lit class or something along those lines. What you may not remember is that all those tales that are in the Canterbury Tales, each one was dealing with a deadly sin. And the portion of the Canterbury Tales that you probably did not read, because it is almost never printed in copies of the Canterbury Tales, is the Parson's Tale. Because the Parson's Tale, it's the very last of the tales, but it's not a tale, it's not a poem. It's prose. Not a poem, it's prose, and it's not a tale, it's a sermon. Well, of course it's a sermon. It's the preacher. He's preaching a sermon about the deadly sins, why they're bad. He's just listened to 24, gaudy tales that all these other folks have been telling, and so he goes to town, absolutely gives you way more than you ever want to know about why those deadly sins are bad, but he also tells you what you can do to get past them. What are the antidotes for each one of these deadly sins? You probably don't want to try to buy it, but you can get it online. Look up anything online these days and you can find it. So you can read the sermon if you would like. Well, all right, so if you can't find it in the Bible and you don't want to read these old tales, what are the 7 deadly sins? Well, there they are. Pride, sometimes called vainglory, or vanity for short. Envy, greed, lust, anger, sometimes called wrath, gluttony, and sloth, sometimes referred to as sadness. Got to wait till the very last week to deal with that. Now, if your short-term memory is as bad as mine has become, and I'm just thinking based on your ages, it might very well be. You may not be able to remember 7 things. That's about the limit of short-term memory anyway. So let's just remember one thing. Let's make an acronym out of this. The deadly sins are peg-lags. Okay?
That helped.
They are peg-lags, yeah. Almost a piracy, not quite, but peg-lags. So that's your key to the 7 deadly sins. Peg-lags. Pride, envy, greed, lust, anger, gluttony, sloth. Peg-lags. Just one you got to remember. When we call them deadly sins, there's not a suggestion that these are the absolute worst things you could ever do. It's rather that these are the seeds from which all other sins seem to spring. And so in that sense, these are the deadly ones. Not that they're the worst, but they give rise to all the others in which you can engage. They are, internal, attitudinal, constitutional, habitual things that just become a part of who you are that you can't ever seem to fully get away from. And so all these others begin to then attach themselves to it. This is not how you can deal with deadly sins. I'll have a few pictures over the next several weeks that show various ways that these deadly sins are personified. But you can, once you see that, you can kind of think your way through it. Here's anger, here's pride, and there's lust, the third one. And you can just kind of sloth is the middle one, and you can see them as you walk your way through it. And there's all kinds of personifications of these deadly sins that we can look at, and we will. Gluttony is the very last one there. One of the neat things that that those early monks like Evagrius did was they realized very, very early on, because people would come to them and ask them for information. They would ask them for counseling help. They would talk to them, can you help me deal with this or that or the other thing? And so those early monks realized that these deadly sins gave them an angle, if you will, to be able to address all the other things that are wrong with people. And they very quickly realized, as I've already been suggesting, that these sins lead to other sins. And so they came up with trees of deadly sins. They also came up with trees of virtues, but that's not my portion of this. That's James, so I'll leave that be. But
I didn't do it.
it'll come back in a moment, I think. for me. The tree on the left. The tree on the left, as soon as it does come back, had branches, and those branches then went out to one of the other deadly sins, and then the fruit on that particular branch. Oh, come back. Stu said you'd come back. Whether it does or not, you can still listen to me. So they developed these trees of virtues and vices as a pastoral aid. So that if you came to Ken the priest or Ken the monk and said that you were having trouble with gossip, for instance. Well, gossip's not one of the deadly sins, but gossip is one of the low-hanging fruit on one of the branches of the deadly sins. And so when you talk about having problems with gossip, Ken, who has memorized the tree of deadly sins, knows that your real problem is not gossip, your real problem is, and so he can begin to address that. So it was a wonderful pastoral aid, a way to engage in the kind of penitential examination that we need to do. One of the wonderful things that Dante did in the Divine Comedy was he divided these 7 deadly sins into types of love. All 3 types of love had problems. The first kind of love that he said that was a problem was perverted love. And by that he meant that you start out with love, but because you get so wrapped up in loving yourself, you end up turning your back upon the community. You fall out of love with the community as you fell into love with yourself. And so he called that perverted love. And the 3 kinds of deadly sins that are examples of perverted love are pride, envy, and anger. All 3 of those you get wrapped up in yourself. When he talked about excessive love, he said this particular kind of love, it starts with love and in the community, but you start using the community in ways that are inappropriate. You don't turn your back on it, but you start using it inappropriately. Well, for this particular, there's also a list of 3 here. Greed, gluttony, and lust are the 3 that match up here with excessive love. And then the third, he called defective love. Defective love is you just forget all about love. You just don't even end up caring. Sloth. He calls it defective love. I really wish this would come back up because I've got all kinds of fun things to show you.
Turn it off, you back on.
Who knows whether it would work or not? Do you know anything about things like this, Carl?
Oh, man. Well,
Carl is my cousin, and he takes care of all the technology down at Westport High School.
well,
That's not why he's here tonight. But that's one of those God things. We're glad he's here. So there's all kinds of art and literature across the centuries that we can point to and look at, etc. We don't have time to do all that, but here's an example. Hieronymus Bosch. That is in the middle, that's an eyeball. You may not realize that's an eyeball, but that's an eyeball. And right in the middle of it is Jesus. It's what you should be looking at. Whether you are or whether you are not, Jesus can see you through your eye. You look into people's eyes and you learn about it. So that's where Jesus is. But the iris around, each one of those are deadly sins. And then down in the left corner, this is hell. Again, more examples of deadly sins. And on the right is heaven. And on the top, that's death and then the Last Judgment over the other side at the top. We'll come back to some of this as the weeks go by. There's the example of hell down in the left corner. Or there's Peter Bruegel. Some of his stuff is copied by Peter von der Heyden. This is the example for sloth. You'll see this again in another 7 weeks or so. Really weird drawings that are a lot of fun to look at. If you're not into medieval art, well, then there's always, of course, movies. Back in the mid-'80s, you may or may not have watched the movie by Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman called Seven. It actually was dealing with each of the 7 deadly sins. Or the one that I appreciated was written by a medieval philosophical scholar who decided nobody was reading his books. Oh, thank you. Nobody was reading his books, so he decided to write a novel, and everybody started reading them. It was called The Name of the Rose, and there was a movie that had Sean Connery in it and a very, very young Christian Slater, also dealing with the 7 deadly sins. And if that's just too much for you, well, 2 or 3 years ago, they put out a movie that was starring Zachary Levi, and it was Shazam. This is not the Gomer Pyle Shazam. This was Zachary Levi's Shazam. Well, all right. So there's your introduction. Let's jump into to Pride now for a few minutes. The Greek word for pride is hubris. At least the primary Greek word is hubris. And if we're doing Latin, then it's superbia, superb. Is the word for pride. Everybody has pride, the bad version of it. Some of us just have it worse than others. Kansas State University, about 15 years ago or so, Kansas State University came out with what they call sin maps. They plotted on a county-by-county basis across the entire United States. Blue is good, red is not. Which counties were the worst at that particular sin? Well, pride is sort of an aggregate of all of the various deadly sins. So this puts them all together. If you, I'm not going to get close to that, but if you live in sort of central Missouri, Kansas, you've got some real problems there just above Fort Scott. But there's not a problem of any sort whatsoever in northwest Arkansas, in Benton and Washington County. So you're in good shape. But, stay away from the California and some of those spots. All right, let's jump in then with kind of a historical view of pride. Let's start with classical literature, Greek literature, and then we'll move through Old Testament, New Testament, and then into some theological issues at the tail end of this section. For the classical Greeks, they're not really thinking about sin, certainly the way that the church thinks about sin, but they do talk about sin as a kind of transgression, and by that they mean sort of an infringement upon the things that really are for the divine to be dealing with. And as an example of this, think Achilles. He has this exalted, arrogant, prideful belief that he's immortal. You can't hurt me. Except there was that one little bit of him when he got dipped down into immortality that didn't get immortality on him. And so it was just a belief that he was. It was an arrogant, wrong-headed infringement upon the divine that ultimately got him in trouble. Achilles healed. Or it was something that you could contrast with modesty. And here, the classical literature would point to somebody like Odysseus, who, remember the story of when he meets up with the Cyclops, and the Cyclops starts eating all of his men, and there's all those issues that he deals with there. And he on the front end says that his name is Nobody. And then they poke out the eyeball of the Cyclops, and things just get, in some ways, better, but they get way worse. And when he finally gets out and they escape from the now blinded Cyclops, he cannot refrain from, when he's on his ship and leaving, yelling back at the Cyclops and saying, "Oh, by the way, my name is Odysseus." Well, the Cyclops was the son of Poseidon. And so now he knows his name. And so he tells Daddy on Odysseus, and Odysseus gets in trouble. No modesty on Odysseus's part. He was full of pride, hubris. So pride is a kind of overstepping of the bounds in classical literature. It's hubris. It's kind of a rebellious willingness to abide in your present state. You don't want to stay there. You want to become more than what you are. And here, classical literature would talk about Icarus. Remember his story. He wants to be able to fly, and he creates wings. He gets wax and feathers, and he puts them all together, and sure enough, he flies. But he's so full of himself that he flies too close to the sun, and the sun melts the wax, and the feathers fall off, and poor Icarus crashes back to earth. An unwillingness to abide in his present state. He tried to be free of all restraints, only to discover that he ultimately could not. One of the other ways that they talked about hubris is arrogance, a form of ambition on the part of others. Something you wanted to become more than what you actually are. You hope to be better. Not in a good way, but you just hope to be kind of the GOAT, the best that is possible out there. Here, this jumps way beyond classical literature, but one of the great examples of this is in John Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, for Satan, who would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. Well, by the 5th century BC, pride is starting to become what we would know as sin, not only against other gods, but also against human beings. You want to impose your might and your right upon other people, which is always inappropriate. There's a bit of precariousness in that when you start doing that, because when you start taking advantage of others and trying to impose your will on them, then you're giving them license to turn around and do the same thing to you. One of the children's playtime antics that we probably all engaged in at some point in time was King of the Mountain or Queen of the Mountain, where you try to get to the top and then push they all try to get up there and replace you, and you keep knocking them down. Well, sooner or later, one of them's going to get up there and replace you. Well, that's your nemesis. The nemesis is the downfall of the one who's at the top. Anybody who strives to be at the top is eventually going to be supplanted. Hopefully, by this stage in our lives, we kind of all know that. If that's your hope, is to be the best, sorry, you're going to get bumped off at some point in time. Plato and other Greek philosophers will begin to put all of this together into very practical terms, and they will say that for instance, in youth, pride tends to show itself as all of these things in the attacks that they make upon parents. They try to throw off the rule, for instance, of their parents, throw off all those external restraints that are being imposed upon them. And then once they start doing that with parents, well, then they start trying to do it with school figures and others. And it begins to then escalate, and it may very well be that many of us are still bound up with that. And we're just trying to throw off restraints from other people and other institutions in our lives. Reject public authority, public orders of whatever sort that are out there because we're just so infatuated with ourselves. Well, in the Old Testament, it begins to shift a bit. It's not so much a rebellious unwillingness to abide in your present state, but it becomes really more a sense of of arrogance and stubbornness and insolence. You could start right off the bat in Genesis 3. You want to be God. You don't want to have to listen to God. You don't want God to be authoritative over you. You want to be God and decide what the rules will be for yourself and for others. You will determine right and wrong. Not let somebody else tell you what it is. Well, we do that all the time, don't we? One of the other ways that this tends to take place in people, certainly in the Old Testament, in Isaiah chapter 2, or in Isaiah 14, or in Ezekiel 28, where they start talking about the king of Babylon or the king of Tyre. When we talk about the king of Babylon, that's also a reference in there to Lucifer, but it's not talking about the devil, it's talking about the star of the morning. They want to forsake the traditions of others. Pride becomes equated with idolatry of one's own self. I'm the one who will determine the way things will be wherever I am. The other Old Testament examples of this are Pharaoh. And it begins to define sin as a kind of stubbornness, being hard-hearted. If you are Hebrew, the version is not stubborn hard-heartedness. It is rather insolent, stiff-neckedness, where you begin to try one's patience. You become brazen, disrespectful, cheeky. I don't care if that's what you want me to do, God. I want to do this. I don't care if you want me to go to Canaan. I want to go back and eat leeks and watermelons back in Egypt. Now again, let me mention here that the point of this is not for you to get information so that you can go, yeah, I always thought so-and-so was guilty of that. It's rather so that you can delve deeper into yourself and think about it. In the Apocrypha, there's not a whole lot of change from the Old Testament times. It's very similar in its understanding, and here's two ways that the Apocryphal writers think about arrogance or pride. And one of the best examples is from Sirach. The beginning of pride is stubbornness. I'm going to do it my way. Of course, Frank Sinatra wasn't stubborn or prideful at all, but we're still going to do it our way. Around Hieronymus Bosch's eyeball, it had Jesus in the middle. Here's a little section for pride. The woman, it looks like she has a lampshade on her head. Sorry, this is the way it looks like to me. But what you really need to notice is that she's looking up in a mirror. There's always mirrors when we get to pride because of the vanity, vainglory, expression of pride. So she's looking as good as she can possibly look. Here's the Peter Bruegel version. In his stuff, look for peacocks. There's peacocks all over. And again, there's mirrors everywhere. Lots and lots of mirrors. Well, all right. So pride is departing from just yourself. You're shrugging your shoulders at God. You don't want God to have any authority over you. You want to be the authority. So when you move into New Testament periods, it's really intriguing because there's a huge shift that begins to happen now. Hubris is not just arrogance. It becomes this, violent treatment of others. Setting yourself up as king of the mountain means you have to toss others down. And so the New Testament begins to recognize and point to that violent activities in which you engage, the ways you treat others. And there's some of the places we just don't have time to jump in there to see how it kind of plays out in the New Testament. But there's the 8 places in the New Testament where hubris shows up. And in each one of those, there's always some violent act that's taking place. When I saw that cartoon, I just thought of Patty. The way I get treated every day.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, there's another word in the Greek that's used a lot in the New Testament. It's not quite as often as hubris, huperethenos. This one also is a kind of arrogance, and it's a looking down your nose at other people. That's the shade of meaning here. Well, you can see Luke 151 showing up here. This is right in the middle of Mary's Magnificat. God is going to bring down the mighty. He's not going to allow them to remain there. They cannot ultimately, forever, have contempt for the common person. That's for you, Catherine.
I don't know what I did to deserve that.
It's a carryover. It's a carryover.
And there's yet a third word, lotzoneia. This one is more along the lines of vainglory, the vanity that we engage in our arrogance, the confidence that we have in our own cleverness to get by, just by ourselves. We can engage in schemes that others can't see through. So there's a lot of pretense that gets involved in this particular one.
Yeah.
Well, all right, as we switch over to Christian theology itself, pride is very much a contempt that we have for God. I'm going to do it my way. I'm not interested in what God has to say. I'm not going to obey God ultimately. God may say this, but I want to do this other thing. And so there's this obstinate selfishness that's kind of built into it. No church is going to tell me what I can do. No pastor is going to tell me what I can do or not do. Who says you're right? I can decide for myself what is right, et cetera, et cetera. And when you start down that road, very quickly you're right back to Genesis 3, aren't you? Did God really say? Well, all right, so pride divides really into two pieces in Christian theology. There's the pride side, and there's the vainglory or vanity side. If we had lots of time here, I'd love to talk about the vanity side. We just don't have time. The pride side, you desire to be the absolute best that's capable of being. You really do want to be the best. You want to be the greatest of all time. And you see that with sports figures and politicians and and other folks, but you know, we're guilty of it too. And even though we're not going to be the biggest and best, we find ways where we can still accomplish that. We become the biggest fish in a smaller pond. You know, we can't make it at Harvard, so we'll go to Arkansas, you know, and be a professor, whatever. Can't do it in a big church, so we'll do it in a little church. And I can still be the big man or the big woman on campus. Once you start down that road, then it becomes easy to start treating other people with a bit of disdain. Start looking down your nose at them, treating them with contempt, because they're not as good as you. They're not as wise as you. They don't understand things quite as well as you do, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's a bit of falsehood involved in that, isn't there? Never mind these understandings of merit, whether there really is or not merit. One of the ones that drives me crazy is all of the clergy who go get themselves a doctorate of ministry as opposed to a PhD and then walk around for the rest of their lives calling themselves Dr. whoever, Dr. Underwood. You can get a real degree, you just got to amen. And that's what it is. We've got enough preachers with demons. We don't need them to get the vainglory side of things. You don't really care if you're the best. You just want people to think you are the best. It's appearance. It's seeming to be. Who cares if it really is? If I can pull it off, it doesn't matter. I still get treated the same just by seeming to be, as opposed to really being. So I desire to look the best, rather than just be deemed the best. And I can then be kind of slothful about it and not worry about trying to really become the best. Lots and lots of examples here. I'm just going to toss out some very quickly. Guys who spend lots of time weightlifting so they can have bulging muscles. Or women who have cosmetic surgery, guys who have cosmetic surgeries, hair coloring, to look something that you're really not. Get an expensive car, as if somehow or other that makes you better than what you would be without your expensive car. Or all those stickers that people put on their cars. Proud parent of blah, 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 elementary school student. As if having that child makes you somehow better. And this one drives me crazy, answering phone calls in public. You're walking down in Walmart, you've got some little thing stuck in your ear, and you're talking loudly so everybody around you thinks you're talking to them, but you're really you're showing how important you are. And even in there in the middle of Walmart, you've got to be dealing with this, whatever.
Now, you haven't even talked about people doing that in the bathroom. The bathroom at Target?
Yeah, I've never been in the women's bathroom.
Oh, that's good news.
It's all an illusion. It's not real. Well, all right. Got just a few minutes left before I need to pass this over to James. What are some of the sins to which pride gives birth? Well, disobedience. It begins to set the immature or the emotionally immature at odds with all kinds of authorities, whether it's parents or school or church or whatever, and they ultimately say, no, I'm not going to do it. Just not going to do it. Disobedient. Or it leads to boasting and hypocrisy. And while I said let's not point fingers, the good examples here of people who just can't end up communicating very well, they just can't communicate intelligibly. The people that I don't watch TV, but I do watch the Kansas City Chiefs play football every week. And I enjoy seeing the various guys or listening to them, ones who get mic'd up in the middle of a game. But what you very quickly discover is that they can't talk worth nothing. They're just completely unintelligible. They walk around going, they can't, there's no communication that goes on. But they're full of themselves, and their arrogance is just nothing but gibberish. Or they become impatient and full of scorn. You know, you erect barriers against other people that allow you to look down your nose at them. It happens in church all the time too. You know, people on the right wing of the church look down their nose at people on the left wing of the church because they're not holy like we are. Whereas people on the left look down their noses at people on the right because they actually believe that stuff, and you know, and they're not as wise as we are, and you know, on and on and on and on. But it's that looking down your nose at others, seeing yourself as better than, or it leads to impatience, strife. You don't cooperate with others. Think about our Congress. You know, I didn't come up with the idea, so I'm not going to cooperate. It's an element of pride. You do what you want to do, when you want to do it, because you want to do it. Self-centeredness. And while I don't have it up here, I'm going to call it love of novelty is one of the things that is just a supreme example of pride in our own day. You've got to have the latest and the best. That shows that you're better than everyone else. Who is the first to own the newest blankety-blank phone or the newest gadget? You know, we've got a brand new gadget, so I can't talk here, but get the latest and best. It shows that you're better than everyone around you. Well, advertising is dependent on that, isn't it? It breeds it in us to where we want it. That was for you, Steve.
Thank you.
Well, there are forms that pride takes in various people as well. In intellectuals, pride begins to help them retreat from all the mediocrities of the mass culture. I'm above that. I don't have to be like that. I sit in my, in my tweed jacket and my pipe in my mouth and no better than any of you. I will let that go. If you mix pride up with a lot of other sins, it creates even worse problems. If you mix it up with envy, then you start thinking that you deserve better than you really get. And so you get angry at people an awful lot. And you start wanting to pull others down. They shouldn't be there. I'm going to make sure that they don't stay there. Or greed. You start dressing more extravagantly than you even have money to be able to dress yourself, and you get more home than you really need, even though you don't have the money to be able to take care of it. You mix it up with lust, and you start using other people. You don't have any regard for their feelings. You're just going to use them the way you want to anyway. Dehumanize them. Mix it up with anger and become stubborn. Mix it up with gluttony, and you start being like some people whom you may know, maybe even like yourself, where, well, wasn't that food isn't fixed exactly the way I want it, therefore I'm not going to eat it. Just throw it away. Can't eat what's put in front of you. I guarantee you, one of the things as clergy you learn to do very quickly is whenever somebody puts in front of you, you eat. Because they're trying their best to show their love. Who should you be? Decide you're so much better than them, you're not going to touch that. Well, so what's the remedy for pride? main remedy for pride is to start practicing some humility, some proper self-perspective. It's not that you think less of yourself than you are. It's that you think properly of yourself as you are. If you're a good lawyer, if you're a good preacher, if you're a good teacher, if you're a good whatever, well, own up to that. It's what God gave you. Just don't use that to make everybody else treat you as something special. Use those tools that God has given you for the right and appropriate reasons. That's perfectly correct. Trying to, as a kind of sham modesty, act like you are less than you really are is just as bad as acting as if you are better than you are. Take your rightful place in the universe. And one last thing. Well, how do you know that you have issues with pride? Well, one of the best ways to detect whether you have issues with pride does it bother you that other people have pride? That's probably a point where you need to look pretty deeply at yourself. James?
Comic relief. I've not seen any of Bond's stuff, and he hasn't seen mine, so there is some, you'll see some of the same slides. Good. Walmart computers, I went ahead and use there, so you never know if it's gonna. Perfect. All right, a little housekeeping just to explain or remind you, if you guys were in the Job study, that Vaughn and my approach is a little bit different. I know that when he saw me carrying in the props, I'm sure he's like, oh boy, here we go. But just to use an analogy as far as a Bible translation goes, you have your really word for word. A lot of people will say the NASB is about as good to the word for word translation you can get. Then way over to the side, you'll get your Message Bible, and that's probably going to be a little bit more. Vaughn's going to be more on the Amplified. I'm probably going to be a little bit more on the Message version. So, whereas Vaughn may say more like at the bottom, henceforth let it be known, my belly consists of emptiness. I'm probably just going to say, Mom, I'm hungry. So, with that being said, similar slide. You don't see, it's funny, you don't see very many movies or blockbusters with Brad Pitt on the 7 Virtues, but you will see him on the 7 Deadly Sins. And who knows who that is? What movie?
Ben-Hur.
Oh, yes.
We're old.
What year did it win Best Picture?
Way before I was born.
57?
Close, 59. Very close. And in the back, that's part of the props I brought in. When my wife and I lived in New York, there was a wonderful biblical, it was secular, but it's a biblical Jewish and Christian art center. They just had a lot of different things. They did a piece on real religion, R-E-E-L. So they actually had the outfit Moses wore, Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. They had all kinds of stuff. So obviously you're not going to get that in the back, but you'll get a few little interesting things from the movie Ben-Hur. It's not Ben-Hur's shoes, but it's the Emperor's shoes in the movie. And there's a few other little things back there. Feel free to pick them up. It's not like it's, right now they're on display at the Biblical History Museum. But the reason I kind of brought up Ben-Hur in this, and we probably won't tonight just because of the condensing so much into just two lectures into one night, but I would definitely encourage you guys to go back and watch Ben-Hur, especially now that it's leading into Lent, Easter. And one thing about the movie is it's really interesting the way it's done, to where Christ is just kind of in the background. I mean, it all kind of comes together, but in the author, Luke Wallace, 1880, wrote about a few comments on specifically the virtues. That's part of the reason I quoted it. One of the lines from the novel turned into a movie: "If faith were worthy, reward in the person of Gaspar, and love in that of Melanchthon, surely he should have some special need, who through a long life had so excellently illustrated the three virtues in combination: faith, love, and good works." And one nice thing about that movie is, if you kind of look at it, it was written by a non-believer, agnostic. Some people describe Wallace as an atheist, but he ended up kind of slowly but surely transitioning into this coming out of the Civil War. And one little article here: Wallace was a Civil War general, ambassador, senator, governor, inventor, and lawyer, but best known as being the author of Ben-Hur. To Wallace, Ben-Hur's choice between revenge and forgiveness represented America's path to healing after the Civil War. Following the North's victory, the nation was still deeply divided. North and South were two distinct societies. The slaves were free, but no one knew how to integrate them back into society. The controversial and disastrous policy of Reconstruction was running its course, deepening the wounds of the war, and almost sounds familiar today. So Ben-Hur, and like I said, I would highly encourage you guys to watch at least the trailers where I was going to show the first night, and then one clip the following night, just kind of showing, you could have picked any movie or book. I mean, Lord of the Rings, you're going to see the virtues and the vices throughout that. Chronicles of Narnia. Anyone like Westerns? You know that one? That was a good one. Or going all the way back to the classics, the Odyssey. You're going to see that time and time again. But one thing just to kind of keep in mind, because when I was looking this up, I didn't actually know that much about. I was like, virtues. So how many are there? And then every list you look at is a little bit different. I'm like, well, which one's which? And then when Vaughn thankfully got the pamphlet, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go with this. But one thing to remember: virtue isn't often associated with manliness these days. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Many believe if you aren't a real man unless you're a bad boy or a rebel. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, the virtue comes from the Latin word vir, meaning man. Virtue literally means manliness. So in ancient times, philosophers like Aristotle encouraged men to cultivate virtue to reach their full potential. And again, this was not some chauvinistic attempt to exclude women, anything of the such, as the virtues would come to encompass the entire church. Paul defined where there is neither Greek, Jew, male, female, slave, or freed, all one in Christ. And I think that was Galatians 3. So, getting still a little bit more specific, the church specifically teaches that we should cultivate 7 different virtues, 4 cardinal or natural virtues, and 3 theological or supernatural virtues. The virtues are prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, and the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, or love. We'll kind of get into some of those differences as we go. And so again, why does virtue matter? For the Christian, virtue isn't an option. We have to cultivate virtue, both natural and supernatural, if we want to live a holy life and continue to progress in our walk with Christ. You hear the word sanctification, which just means, hopefully, James last year versus today, hopefully I'm better today, hopefully I'm a little better tomorrow, just as we continually look for little inroads to be better Christians. St. Paul talks about the very fact in his letter to the Romans, when he says, if you live a life of nature, you are marked out for death. If you mortify the ways of nature through the power of the Spirit, you will have life. And again, Vaughn and I are going to do our best. So, in Christian tradition, the 7 heavenly virtues, like we said, combine the 4 cardinal, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, and the 3 theological, faith, hope, and charity, or love. The 7 capital virtues are also as contrary, as Vaughn was saying, or remedial to the vices or the 7 deadly sins. So they're often, you'll often hear them enumerated as chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, kindness, patience, and humility. But again, we're going to kind of go through that. But I mean, the primary aim here is really just to kind of give an overview of the virtues as an excellent way of being, and why the church has historically looked at these as part and parcel of the Christian life. I know who that is.
Yep. Swedish chef.
So I do think that the chef analogy works pretty good. I mean, the recipe, as far as if you're looking at whether it be, putting something together, how to treat the eggs, grains, spices, provides rules for baking, frying, grilling the various parts, so that in the end we come up with a dish that is better and more complete and tasty, hopefully, than their independent parts. Obviously, the limitations on recipes and rules are that they simply provide guidelines from the perspective of the individual who is not internalized them. Rules may tell us what to do, but they don't tell us how to be. So real quickly, the consensus across all cultures, and that's what we're going to kind of touch on here for a few minutes, seem to be that a virtue is an excellent and stable quality of the soul that enables a person to act well regarding some kind of activity. Just as there are characteristics that marks intellectual or moral excellence, there are also characteristics that are marks of moral failure, such as dispositions to dishonesty, injustice, arrogance, greed. And again, these dispositions have been presented and defended by Vaughn, joking. Suffice it to say, the criteria for what constitutes a vice corresponds in important ways to the virtue. So again, one of the easiest things just to keep in mind, virtues are gifts from God that lead us to live in a close relationship with Him. Virtues are like habits. They need to be practiced. They can be lost if they're neglected. The 3 most important virtues, called theological virtues, because they come from God and lead to God, whereas the cardinal virtues are just human virtues acquired by education, good actions. Cardinal comes from cardo, the Latin word for hinge, meaning that on which others depend. And although we can trace the origins of the virtues back in the West to Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, you can also find them in various religious traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism before that. And a common theme is that they all appeal to the idea that people should develop stable dispositions that assist them in the pursuit of a good life. So again, the 4 cardinal virtues were defined in the 4th century by the theologian Ambrose as temperance, justice, prudence, fortitude, but they were also named as cardinal virtues by Augustine of Hippo. So, and were subsequently adopted by the church. Prior to this, and that's one thing just to keep in mind, these 4 qualities, they weren't invented, they did exist before we compiled what we call scripture, or before the 3rd, 4th century, when you start to see them a lot more within the frame of the church. So again, Cicero, you're going to see a lot here on, if you've ever read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, lots there. They can also be found in the Jewish books of wisdom, which states that wisdom teaches moderation, prudence, righteousness, and fortitude, and nothing in life is more useful than these. The theological virtues are named by Paul, the apostle, 1 Corinthians 13. So faith, hope, love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The word love is translated in the King James Bible as charity. So you will see when you look at a list, you're like, why is this list a little bit different? So that part of it, it drove me nuts for a little bit, because I was like, why is this constantly not matching? The Greek writer Prudentius, Aurelius Prudentius, was a Roman Christian poet born around 348. Writing in the 5th century, was the first author to allegorically represent Christian morality as a struggle between 7 sins and 7 virtues. So just kind of keep in mind, that's when you kind of really start seeing it come together. But he actually defined them a little bit different. He ended up defining chastity to lust, faith to idolatry, good works to greed, concord, discord, sobriety, indulgence, patience, wrath, humility, and pride. But the success of that poem popularized the concept of the capital virtues among medieval scholars. So in AD 590, the 7 capital vices were revised by Pope Gregory I, which led to the creation of a new list of corresponding capital virtues. And that's where you kind of see why, yes, there's different ones. Okay, why was it, it was almost kind of evolving as the church kind of came back together on these. So again, you could look at Ambrose and say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. This is where, you start seeing things come together. One of his contemporaries, Augustine of Hippo, revised them a little bit further. Fast forward to Thomas Aquinas, and that's really where we're going to kind of, at least my point, that's mostly where we're going to kind of stay. Because he really kind of solidified it and pulled everything together. But yeah, the point being on this is basically that with the coming of Christ, these virtues seem to become more than just floating pieces with no real objective end. Be good for goodness sake. Well, whose goodness? So the metamorphosis of the virtues brought about by the foundation of the church really occupied 2 distinct stages. The feeble, despised, persecuted church, pre-Constantine, and the decree of Constantine, where the Roman or Byzantine Empire officially adopted Christianity, not just tolerated it. So that again is why you see a lot of parallels between Greek thought within Christians. And again, all this to say, by taking some of these early values, the church was faced with the necessity of reinterpreting them in light of Christian revelation. And in a Christian state, the old virtues must be brought to a new pattern, and it was to be one of the tasks of the church's thinkers for the next 9 centuries, again, like I said, from Ambrose to Aquinas, to effect the redefinition of the virtues and how exactly the church should adopt and adapt them. And again, while a lot more could be said, it's an interesting topic. So, I mean, if you end up just Googling 7 virtues, and you will start to see, wait, okay, here's a group, and you'll kind of see where we really go from Ambrose of Milan around, say, 350, Augustine of Hippo, 375. And again, in principle, Augustine follows the view of the ancient Greeks that virtue is sufficient or at least relevant for happiness. There are several differences, though. The entire structure is made dependent on God's grace, which is a big one. Augustine accepts Cicero's definition of virtue as the art of living well, but emphatically rejects his equation of living well and living happily as being the base of true happiness. Without God, it's completely devoid. And then by the time you get to Thomas Aquinas, in his magnum opus Summa Theologica, we may reduce the whole of moral matters to the consideration of the virtues, which themselves may be reduced in number to 7. 3 of these are theological, and and then 4 are the cardinal virtues of which we shall treat afterwards. And this is probably a pretty good spot to transition, but really just know that the virtues receive the greatest attention from Aristotle and the Greeks up through Thomas Aquinas. What you will see, though, which is interesting, is if you keep going, like during the Enlightenment, you'll see people like David Hume, Voltaire. I saw Vaughn had a quote by Voltaire, who tries to redefine the virtues as self-interest and pleasure-based. Kind of sounds familiar with today's world. And again, Immanuel Kant tries to point back to reason alone as the locus of right action. And again, this is why during Enlightenment you see them kind of marching on Notre Dame and everything else. But needless to say, it's kind of really, even to this day, when they say the 7 virtues, you don't think Hume, you don't think, really Ambrose, you really do go back to Aquinas. So again, virtues are built on the very premise of us made in the image of God, and with that, they help us cultivate a Christian spirit. Secondly, though these virtues carry back through history, I'm going to take a more Thomistic account going forward. Lastly, with the even more popular need for self-help books, we can see that there's at least some areas where people aren't happy with their lives. The virtues not only take this help back to its core, but allow us to see it through a true biblical lens, why these virtues are not just good in and of themselves to make us feel better, but actually make us better in our daily lives. And again, keep in mind the notion of Ben-Hur. And Vaughn had kind of mentioned a virtue tree. Again, you could think of this as anything. It could be good or bad. To Vaughn's point, if you are going to kill someone, you're probably going to be wrathful first. Unless you're a sociopath and just do it for whatever. But the same thing with the virtues. You're going to, honor usually has to have something that leads to it. So the nice thing with just kind of when you see these virtue trees is it does kind of let you see where there's connecting branches. And I think that actually is shown really well throughout the movie Ben-Hur. And again, this is just going to be the trailer. And again, just using little snippets in case because I ran out of things to say. But since we're tight for time now, we're going to go straight to week 2, which is now. And we're going to go into the first one, faith. So first question, how many times is faith mentioned in the Bible? And I'm sure this is ballpark, because there's probably going to be a few differences, but any ballpark guesses? That's it. Close. 231. And when people think of faith, would you say that you would think of it kind of like the famous atheist Bertrand Russell? I'll probably not try to do his accent, so maybe I'll try a little. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. Where there is evidence, no one speaks of faith. We do not speak of faith that 2 and 2 are 4, that the earth is round. We only speak of faith when we wish to substitute emotion for evidence. That's not normally what we mean by faith. Same thing with Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker. What's interesting is Alvin Plantinga, taught at Notre Dame, outspoken Christian, really kind of changed the complete landscape of the mid-20th century and really put God back on the table within the university systems to where today, really atheism, is, for lack of a better word, in retreat. And again, that's why you see a lot more censorship. But in regards to Richard Dawkins, Alvin Plantinga, now philosophers sometimes give bad arguments that are unsound in various ways, but seldom do they give one where the distance between premise and conclusion is as great as it is in this one. Here's the argument. Nobody has proved it impossible, therefore it happened. So again, that's kind of, that was Plantinga's response to The Blind Watchmaker, which was again by Richard Dawkins. So again, this isn't what we mean by faith. An existential leap in the dark, as Kierkegaard would have said. Hebrews 11:1, faith, confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. Romans, so faith comes out of hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Faith is not something we conjure up on our own, nor is it something we're born with, nor is faith the result of diligence and study or pursuit of the spiritual. Ephesians 2 makes it clear that faith is a gift from God, not because we deserve it, have earned it, or are worthy to have it. It is not from ourselves, it is from God. He gets all the glory. So with that, Christian faith is the virtue by which we come to know God and truths about God, especially as these are revealed to us in the Word of God and specifically in Jesus Christ. It is an abiding acceptance by our minds of a type of knowing that is not the result of our simple observations or reasoning. Such knowledge is not contrary to what we can know by our natural thinking, but it concerns things that are beyond our intellectual grasp. And to what extent can human reason, can it lead to knowledge about God and his nature? So that's one part. I mean, I've been always interested in apologetics, but apologetics definitely has its limits. And Aquinas, who wrote a complete defense of Scripture, still recognized this, and that's why I think his breakdown of faith is very helpful. Aquinas clearly thinks that our demonstrative efforts can tell us quite a bit about the divine life. Yet he also insists that it was necessary for God to reveal to us other truths by means of sacred teaching. Unlike knowledge we acquire by our own natural aptitudes, Aquinas contends that revealed knowledge gives us a desire for goods and rewards that exceeds this present life. Also, revealed knowledge may tell us more about God than what our demonstrative efforts actually show. Although our investigative efforts may confirm that God exists, they are unable to prove, for example, that God is fully present in three divine persons, or that it is the Christian God in whom we find complete happiness. So his point being is, kind of like the blind watchmaker or Aristotle's unmoved mover. Well, yes, that absolutely. I mean, strictly from science and strictly from archaeology, anthropology, physics, genetics, you're going to make a very strong cumulative case for God. But you can't rely on human reason alone. Moreover, Aquinas contends that it was fitting for God to make known through divine revelation, even though truths that are accessible to human reason. For this reason, Aquinas insists that having unshakable certitude and pure truth will respect to the divine life require that we avail ourselves to truths revealed by God and held in faith. So what is faith, though? Popular accounts of religion, like we were talking about, Richard Dawkins, faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something. It doesn't matter what. It's total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe that way. Such a view of faith might resonate with contemporary skeptics of religion, but as we shall see, the view is not remotely like the one Aquinas or for historic Christianity endorses at all. And just to go through a little bit here for time. Either case, Aquinas makes the point that we don't actually, so although faith is an intellectual virtue, it would be a mistake to construe the act of faith as something that is purely cognitive in nature, such as the belief that 2 + 2 is 4, or that Venus is a planet, or that red is a primary color. These beliefs are not things over which we have much voluntary control. Perhaps this is because their truth is manifestly obvious, or because they are based on claims that themselves are self-evident. In either case, it doesn't appear that we choose to believe these things. By contrast, the assent of faith is voluntary. To employ Aquinas' terminology, the assent of faith involves not just the intellect, but the will. By will, Aquinas means the native desire or love for what we think contributes to our happiness. So what prompts the will to desire God? After all, Christianity teaches that our wills have been corrupted by the fall. As a result of that corruption, Christian doctrine reports that we are invariably love the wrong things and are inclined to end contrary to God's purposes. And basically, on this piece of it, Aquinas goes back to a voluntary piece. Like, in other words, we have to choose the good. We still have the freedom to say, I see it, but I'm not going to do it. That is faith. The only way we would be motivated to seek God is that if our wills were somehow changed. That is, we must undergo some interior transformation where we come to love God through faith. According to Aquinas, this transformation comes by way of grace. And we'll say more about grace later, but for now we can basically say Aquinas, what he's basically saying is a good making habit that inclines us to seek God and makes us worthy of eternal life. If a person seeks God as the supreme source of human happiness, it can only be because God moves his or her will by conferring grace upon them. That is why Aquinas insists that faith involves a voluntary assent to the divine truth as the command of the will by the grace of God. And that's why you'll end up seeing Bart Ehrman, a noted skeptic, atheist, written a bunch of books against Christianity. Well, he knows more about the Bible than most of us, but he, to Aquinas' point, does not choose that voluntary piece of faith. So it's not a leap in the dark, it's not a stumbling around in the dark, but it's also a lot more than just an intellectual exercise. The University of St. Thomas, 1994 open house, following the completing of a 17-foot by 112-foot fresco on 7 virtues. When the University of St. Thomas commissioned Mark Balma to decorate the Founders Hall, it made a commitment to continuing this tradition of making public spaces a forum for the expression of ideas. The frescoes of St. Thomas are open classroom where students can learn of how ideas can take on new light. And in this particular work, we basically have all 7 virtues discussed by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica: faith, justice, prudence, hope, temperance, fortitude, and charity. And guess what is the foundation of all the other slides and virtues? Faith. This is why Balma's depiction of the virtue is located at the entrance of the building. A family sits together peacefully beneath the golden sun. The sun provides energy to all living things, and although we cannot gaze directly at it, we believe in its power. The family represents love and commitment. The child holds a small gold finch, a Christian symbol of Christ because of its tendency to make nests from the seeds of the thorny thistle. The overall theme of this fresco is creation, and illustrated by the Native American teaching of the Taurus volunteering his back as a place for the people to live when there is no land. And this one comment, and we'll end here, that I thought kind of hit pretty well on the concept of this work of faith. This is a quote by Donald Meisel, pastor emeritus of Presbyterian Church of Minneapolis, specifically on the faith panel. On a personal note, a 16 by 12 representation of the face of faith was given to me a year ago by the university in recognition of my having offered the invocation at the dedication of the first half of the fresco ceiling. My wife Eleanor had it beautifully framed. It watches over me at my desk every day. What does the face say to me? It says that faith is the conviction, the awareness that something of God is in every human face. Faith is the belief that faith is the conviction, the awareness that something of God is in every human face. Faith is the belief that the love of God was based in Jesus Christ. Faith is the certainty that everyone who does the will of God is a child of God. Jesus said as much. In a world of increasing diversity, that needs to be faced. Faith is the thankful sense that by God the face of the whole earth is made new every morning, and we along with it, but pray that it might be so. Faith is the mother of courage and the ability to go on loving in the face of adversity, the capacity to forgive and be forgiven and begin anew, of the confidence that even so much is amiss in our world, God's love still holds sway and will have its final word Thanks be to God.
All right, so this is kind of where we're at. We're going to start each of the next several weeks looking at a particular sin. Next week's going to be envy. And we'll do kind of a historical survey of that particular sin. And then we'll switch over to what we really ought to be dealing with, a virtue that gives us a way out of that particular habit that has become a part of our life. We're kind of at the point where we probably need to stop tonight. But James and I will be around for a little bit, so if you want to ask either one of us any questions, by all means do so. For each of the successive nights, where we don't try to put two lessons together in one, we should have plenty of time for you to be able to just jump in and ask whatever you want to do. We're delighted you're here. We hope you got plenty to eat. We hope that you got plenty to be able to think about as you move for the rest of this week. The examination guides. There is on about the 5th page or so a how-to section that tells you what to do. Flip it over, and there are a couple of prayers. A prayer to pray as you get ready to start the process, and then a prayer at the conclusion of the process, whether you do this in the morning, or noon, or evening. And then the next several pages, there's, I think, 4 pages that deal with pride, because it's the worst of the bunch. And then there's 2 pages that deal with each of the sins after that. I would suggest that what you should do, find yourself a nice quiet place where you're not going to be interrupted. Or, if you have a normal family where you're going to be interrupted, just do your best to find a place where that will happen less than normal. And then just read your way slowly through what you see on the page. That may be just to read a line and then just be quiet. And if the Spirit says something to you about that particular line, take note of it. If the Spirit doesn't say anything to you about that line, well, just don't worry about it. Go on to the next. If the Spirit doesn't tell you about any of these, well, you can go woo-hoo at the end of it. But just, be reflective about each one. Yeah, and don't cheat on it either. But just kind of walk your way through it. Each one of the sins is sort of subdivided into pieces. The pride stuff, being 4 pages, you probably don't want to do all that in one sitting, but you may want to divide it between a few days. But just take time, be reflective, think about it. There is a little bit of space toward the end where you can take some notes if you need to. And it's even divided in such a way where if you don't want to carry this whole booklet around, you can actually rip out the pages and take it with you. Because they're always either 4 pages or 2 pages. It's wonderful how that works that. But anyway, and this comes out, it's been adapted, but it comes out of an older Episcopalian prayer guide, St. Augustine prayer guide. So anyway, enjoy this if you want to. If you've got something else to kind of get you into the Lenten season this year, then by all means use that. But here's the plan, kind of what we did tonight. Food to eat, reflection together, company with one another. Appreciate you coming tonight.
Thank you.